And we'll move on straight to our next witnesses. And we'll be continuing looking at part 2 of the bill. And can I welcome Professor Linda Bauld, Cancer Prevention Champion, Cancer Research UK, and also Professor Britton, UK Centre for Tobacco and Alcohol Studies and Consultant in Respiratory Medicine at the University of Nottingham. I welcome you both. And again, Professor Bauld, can I thank you for your paper in advance of today's session. And we go straight, as you've obviously been sitting in the gallery, we'll go straight to the questions for okay of yourselves. And Gwen, do you want to start, please?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Good morning. As you were sitting in the gallery, perhaps you heard the question I'm going to ask, really, there. Do you think we should be concerned about the young people starting to use e-cigarettes?
Smoking prevalence in the UK is down to 3% in 11 to 15-year-olds, but we have almost 200,000 children still every year who start using tobacco in the UK. And I would far rather that the children who are susceptible to using tobacco tried an e-cigarette instead. I'm not saying, and Cancer Research UK is certainly not advocating, that children who are never smokers should start using e-cigarettes in large numbers. But in terms of the comparison between that and potentially moving on to become a smoker, the risk is far, far less.
Would you agree with me, though, on how the concerns about targeting through the chewing gum flavour and other flavours that are being produced now is definitely targeting the younger element?
So the evidence on targeting is mixed. There are going to be restrictions on e-cigarette marketing, as we've heard from our colleagues from Ash Wales and the TPD, and that is being dealt with. The flavours, though, I think there is a misperception about the flavouring, and I think that's important that we understand the evidence on that. When somebody smokes, one of the harms that happens is it affects their sense of taste and smell. When they stop smoking, they regain some of that, and so the flavours that are in e-cigarettes are useful for adult smokers who move away from tobacco because it separates that tobacco product from the e-cigarette product. So the flavours have a role to play in making e-cigarettes an attractive stop-smoking aid. Whether these flavours are being targeted at children or not is an important question, and that's why the marketing needs to be addressed. But I'm not seeing any evidence from the studies that never smoking children are taking up e-cigarettes in any significant number. So if the marketing is doing that, at the moment, it's not working.
If I could just come in on that. So we do a lot of work with electronic cigarette users, and one of the messages that comes back from them is that the flavours that you and I might perceive as being aimed at children are actually very important to them. And so if you'd asked me this question 18 months ago, I'd have said no, the bubble gum and so on should go. I've changed my view because that's what a lot of adult smokers use, and they find it a very helpful adjunct, as Linda has said.
I think it's watch this space on that.
As with all of this subject.
Yeah.
John?
Yes, I don't know if you heard all the exchanges with the previous witnesses, but I mentioned, as others did, a recent study in Los Angeles which shows that 14-year-olds that tried e-cigarettes were much more likely to go on and use conventional cigarettes than those that hadn't tried e-cigarettes, which would seem to go against what you've said just now, Linda, that you would much prefer young people to try e-cigarettes than tobacco products. I think we'd all prefer them to try e-cigarettes rather than tobacco products if they were going to try one or the other. Mm-hmm. But the point is there may be some that would never smoke cigarettes, but because of the availability of e-cigarettes, they try those and then go on to using tobacco products. Do you accept that this study is worrying from a public health point of view?
No, I mean, we produce an evidence briefing every month for the UK from Cancer Research UK in partnership with Public Health England. So, and I've not only looked carefully at that study, I also know the authors, and I work with them as an editor of the journal Nicotine and Tobacco Research. And Adam Leventhal, who is the lead author on that study, himself would say that there is no proof of causality, as Ash Wales have said, between the children who had tried an e-cigarette, and the measure of use in that study is just having tried an e-cigarette at least once, and then then 12 months later, just over 200 of them went on to try cigarette at least once. Those are very weak measures of use. They were put in a very large survey. They weren't able to add any more detailed questions. The discussion which colleague Alan Davies mentioned, I think is too strongly worded, but in the American context, where the regulatory environment is quite different from ours, and we can talk about that, those kinds of cautionary arguments are being made, but I don't think that the evidence in that study points to a gateway effect. But I would say that we do need to keep track of all these studies and look at them in detail, but I'm not persuaded that that single study is a cause for concern that experimenting or trying an e-cigarette means you will become a smoker.
You mentioned a cautionary approach. I think whether we should take a precautionary approach has been quite prominent in the discussion around possibly restricting the use of e-cigarettes in public places. So that precautionary approach is being taken elsewhere from what you say. Do you see no reason for such an approach to be adopted here in Wales under the proposals in this public health legislation?
So I think the issue we're discussing today is use in public places. The regulatory environment around the world varies greatly, and you're absolutely right that in some jurisdictions they are imposing these kinds of restrictions. I think the UK is in a really interesting position, and Wales as well, in that we have some of the best quality data in the world about what's happening on e-cigarettes at the moment, and we are potentially in a unique position to try and balance the right type of regulation. So in terms of public place use, I support the arguments of my colleagues in Ash Wales, and that I don't think that is a balanced measure. I think you're on balance from the evidence we see that if you put e-cigarettes alongside tobacco and send the message that they are as harmful as tobacco and therefore they cannot be used in public places, we are going to potentially miss the opportunity for more people to move to e-cigarettes and therefore stop smoking.
Alan?
Thank you. I'm interested in what you say about the European Tobacco Products Directive. I think that's generally a good piece of law which will create a regulatory environment for these products, which I think many of us would welcome. I presume that you welcome the points that are in that directive.
It's a very detailed directive. There are some points in there which are contested,
Yes,
but,
I understand.
and that's the levels of nicotine that are contained in the devices, the 20 milligrams per milliliter regulation, which is potentially not a sensible level. Some of the other measures in the TPD we would support.
Which areas would you look towards supporting?
So I think it's appropriate that there be some restrictions on the marketing of these products, although I do think the Advertising Standards Agency has made a good start on that in the UK. I also think there are things there about the brands, the tobacco brands, not allowing to be linked to e-cigarettes. So we shouldn't be seeing an e-cigarette promoted that's a Marlboro e-cigarette, for example. That's very important. So some of those measures are useful. And we also need harmonisation across the EU. And other aspects of the TPD, for example, on packaging and labelling of cigarettes are incredibly important. But the milligrams per milliliter is contested.
I accept that. And I welcome that. I think many of us will welcome the provisions of the TBD. I'm surprised, given what you've just said, that your remarks and your observations on wider marketing issues. When I look at e-cigarette shops that sell these products, the only thing I can think of that reminds me of is head shops, legal highs, given the imagery that is used, the nature of the language that is used, the method of the marketing. And this committee was very, very clear in its inquiry last year, earlier this year, that that marketing is directed at a teenage audience. Very clear. That marketing is directed at a teenage audience. And given that assumption and presumption, which I presume you share, I don't understand how you can then say that this is not creating new behaviour in a market where that behaviour has been, over many, many years, the subject of significant restriction in order to prevent the take-up of tobacco smoking.
Well, let me say something on that, and then I think it's important to hear from John, because I'm talking too much.
That's okay.
The first point I would make, and I would emphasize this, is I think it's really important that we try and make evidence-based policy, and we are not seeing evidence in the UK that never-smoking children are regularly using e-cigarettes in any numbers. So if that's what the marketing is intended to do, it is not succeeding. I think what it may be doing is normalizing vaping, because most e-cigarettes nowadays don't look like cigarettes. And normalizing vaping is quite something separate from that. The final point I would make on the marketing is you raised the point earlier about when you see the marketing claims, the manufacturers are not marketing them as cessation aids, they're marketing them as recreational aids. There's a very important reason why that's the case. When the TPD comes in, they will not be permitted to make any health or cessation claims, and at the moment, under the Advertising Standards Agency rules, they're not really supposed to be doing that either. So the reason they're not making those claims is because they're not permitted to, and they will potentially get into trouble if they do so. And so that's why you're not seeing them, although when you ask vapers and smokers, the reason they use an e-cigarette is to stop smoking.
Yeah, but hang on now, just going to stop you on that. Simply because somebody isn't saying something because they're not allowed to say something is an entirely different argument to that which I was putting forward. I wasn't suggesting that they were being advertised as cessation aids. I didn't suggest that at all. What I suggested was the imagery of the marketing is targeted and appears to me to be targeted as at a young audience. Now, the fact that they're not marketed as a cessation aid is a different argument, and it's one that might be a more useful argument. But it appears to me to be very difficult to sustain an argument that on the one hand, this marketing is clearly aimed at a younger audience, which most people agree, I think. And then secondly, that having accepted that it's not designed to create new behaviours and new habits.
I know John was trying to come in, so let's hear from him.
Okay. First of all, Linda's right. If that is the objective, it's failing. Young people are not taking up electronic cigarettes in this country in large numbers. It's in significant numbers. And there are also good reasons, theoretical reasons, why we might not expect them to. Advertising electronic cigarettes, however, is potentially a very good thing for public health. Having shops in the high street that sell electronic cigarettes as a consumer product to people who are addicted to smoking tobacco is potentially a very good thing. The majority of smokers in the United Kingdom, and I'm sure it's the same in Wales as elsewhere in the UK, are in the sort of the peak age for smoking, the highest prevalence by age is 25. So electronic cigarette advertising will be aimed at younger adults because that's where the smokers are. But what we need to do is to move away from thinking of, are these devices formal cessation aids, things that should be there to help people stop smoking, and see them more as a market alternative to something that currently kills 50% of its regular users. And if we were to step back from that, I would say that the logical approach, given that whilst it would be nice to completely prohibit all tobacco products, that's not going to happen. We will end up with an American-style prohibition situation as for alcohol. The sensible thing is to try to drive the market to change people's behaviour so they choose to adopt much safer products. And in my view, vape shops and the advertising that goes with them is part of that, should be part of that strategy. Now, if we were to be seeing an epidemic of uptake of electronic cigarette use among adolescents, then I think that's a totally different story. But that's not what's happening.
I accept that. I accept that.